Hey there! How are you guys doing? Today I bring to you 3 disturbing true home alone horror stories that will send chills down your spine. These tales of real-life terror will make you think twice about staying home alone. So, grab your popcorn, turn off the lights, and get ready to be scared. Let's dive into these creepy, spine-tingling stories that prove sometimes the scariest things happen when you're all alone. And if you enjoy this video and want to listen to similar stories in the future, please consider subscribing.
Story 1. The Ghost in the Storage Building.
13-year-old Jake woke up with a start, his heart racing. It was just a dream, he told himself, rolling over and burying his face in his pillow. But deep down, he knew that something was off. Something felt wrong. He glanced over at his bedroom window, the curtains billowing gently in the morning breeze. The sun streamed through, painting the room with warm, golden light. But still, a chill ran down his spine. Jake lived in a small, rural town in Michigan, nestled among the rolling hills and dense forests of the Mitten State. His house sat on a sizable plot of land, with a well-tended garden out front and a large, sprawling backyard. In one corner of the yard stood a ramshackle storage building, its weathered boards creaking in the wind and its rusty metal roof groaning ominously. It was an eyesore, really, but to Jake, it was a place of wonder and mystery. It was the one place where he felt truly alive. Jake threw off his covers and swung his legs out of bed, his eyes drifting toward the storage building. It was unusual for his parents to leave it unlocked, but they must have forgotten. A mischievous smile crept across his face as he slipped on his sneakers and quietly made his way downstairs. He paused at the back door, listening carefully for any signs of movement, and then slipped outside. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the earthy scent of autumn. Jake glanced around, his heart racing with excitement as he approached the storage building. Its door stood ajar, the wood splintered and hanging loose on its rusted hinges. Fresh footprints were visible in the grass, leading away from the structure and toward the edge of the woods. Jake frowned. Whoever had been here, they must have left in a hurry. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The musty smell of mold and damp wood enveloped him, and the dim light that filtered through the cracked boards cast eerie shadows across the dusty floor. The room was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He crept farther into the storage building, his eyes darting left and right, searching for any signs of the intruder. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from upstairs, sending a shiver down his spine. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. Jake's heart leapt into his throat as he dashed up the creaky staircase, his sneakers squeaking on the worn wood. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a smaller room, crammed full of old furniture and knickknacks. In the center of the room, an antique dresser lay on its side, its drawers spilling open and their contents scattered across the floor. But that wasn't what caught his attention. No, it was the woman in the tattered nightgown. Her back turned to him as she appeared to be searching through a pile of boxes. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. The woman moved slowly, her movements graceful and fluid, as if she were underwater. Her long, raven hair cascaded down her back, and her pale, slender fingers traced along the dusty wood of the boxes. As he watched, she paused and looked over her shoulder, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. For a split second, their eyes met, and Jake was frozen in place. Then, without warning, she vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest trace of a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here, Jake." Shaking with fear, Jake stumbled backward, his knees hitting the floor with a thud. He scrambled to his feet and raced down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He threw open the door and dashed out of the storage building, the cool air of the morning rushing in to greet him. He sprinted across the yard, his sneakers digging into the soft earth as he raced toward his uncle's house, just a few doors down. Panting and wheezing, he reached the door and frantically dialed his uncle's number, his fingers trembling as he pressed the buttons. "Uncle Tim," he gasped when his uncle answered. "There's someone in the storage building." The line went dead. Jake stood there, his shoulders slumping, the words echoing in his mind. Someone was in the storage building, and they knew his name. He didn't know what it all meant, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same again. Uncle Tim arrived at the house within minutes, his face a mask of concern. He listened carefully as Jake recounted the story, his expression growing more serious with each detail. Together, they decided to investigate the storage building once more. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, Uncle Tim led the way, with Jake close behind. They approached the building cautiously, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft ground. The door was still ajar, just as Jake had left it. Uncle Tim pushed the door open and shone the flashlight inside. The musty smell was even stronger now, and the eerie shadows seemed to dance around them. They stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of the mysterious woman. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the building, causing the hair on the back of Jake's neck to stand up. He looked around, but there were no open windows or doors that could explain the draft. Then, they heard it, a soft, whispering voice echoing through the room. "You shouldn't have come here, Jake." Uncle Tim tightened his grip on the bat, his eyes darting around the room. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but tense. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, a soft glow appeared in the corner of the room, growing brighter and brighter until it took the shape of the woman in the tattered nightgown. Her eyes glowed with the same otherworldly light, and she stared directly at Jake. "Why are you here?" Uncle Tim demanded, trying to keep his voice from shaking. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she floated towards them, her feet barely touching the ground. She raised her hand, pointing directly at Jake. "You have to leave this place," she said, her voice echoing around them. "It's not safe for you here." Uncle Tim stepped in front of Jake, shielding him from the ghostly figure. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice firm. The woman lowered her hand, her expression softening. "I was trapped here long ago," she explained. "My spirit cannot rest. You must find the locket and set me free." Jake peeked out from behind his uncle. "Where is the locket?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman gestured towards the pile of boxes in the corner. "It is hidden there. Please, find it and set me free." Uncle Tim nodded and quickly moved to the boxes, sifting through them until he found an old, tarnished locket. He held it up, and the woman smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now, place it in the ground under the old oak tree in the backyard." Jake and Uncle Tim hurried outside, the locket clutched tightly in Jake's hand. They found the old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky. Uncle Tim dug a small hole at the base of the tree, and Jake placed the locket inside. As they covered the locket with dirt, a soft glow emanated from the ground, and they heard the woman's voice one last time. "Thank you, Jake. I am free now." The glow faded, and the air seemed to grow warmer, the chill of fear lifting from Jake's heart. He looked up at his uncle, who smiled and ruffled his hair. "You did good, kid," Uncle Tim said. From that day on, Jake never felt afraid of the storage building again. He and Uncle Tim cleaned it up and turned it into a cozy little hideout where they could play games and tell stories. And every now and then, when the wind blew just right, Jake could swear he heard a gentle whisper thanking him for his bravery.
Story 2. The Midnight Lurker at Gas and Go.
Jane Doe, a petite and attractive young woman with long dark hair and striking green eyes, stood behind the counter of the all-night Gas and Go. It was well past midnight, and the only light in the station came from the dim overhead fluorescence and the flickering screen of the security monitor. She had been working the graveyard shift for the past month, ever since her best friend moved away, and she found herself desperate for the extra cash. Tonight, however, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept glancing out of the corner of her eye, catching glimpses of a shadowy figure lurking outside. Jane took a deep breath and tried to focus on her duties. The store was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old metal chair she was sitting on and the soft hum of the refrigeration unit. The only sound that broke the silence was the low, throaty rumble of a motorcycle idling outside. Jane's heart skipped a beat as she glanced back out the window and saw the rider, a tall, dark-haired man with a menacing grin. His name was Jack, and he had been coming around more often lately, making her feel uncomfortable with his constant flirting and inappropriate comments. Jane tried to ignore him as he strutted up to the counter, his leather-clad body swaying with each step. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered, "Hey there, beautiful. You working late tonight?" Jane tried to keep her expression neutral, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She forced herself to smile politely and respond, "Yes, I'm sorry. We're closed, but I can still help you with whatever you need." Jack chuckled darkly and reached out to caress her cheek. "Oh, I don't think so, sweetheart. I think I want a little something special tonight." His hand moved lower, brushing against her hip. Jane's heart was racing now, but she refused to let him intimidate her. She grabbed his wrist and pulled his hand away, glaring up at him. "Jack, I'm working right now. You need to leave." His eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment Jane thought he was going to hit her. But then, just as suddenly, he seemed to regain his composure. He smirked and said, Fine, fine. I'll leave you alone for now. But remember, Jane, I'll be back." With that, he turned and strode confidently out of the store. Jane exhaled shakily and turned back to her duties, her heart still racing. She tried to focus on restocking the shelves and cleaning up the counter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. As the night wore on, her unease only grew stronger. Finally, she decided she couldn't take it anymore and called her best friend, Lisa, to see if she could come over and give her a ride home. Lisa agreed and promised to be there in half an hour. Just as Jane hung up the phone, she felt a presence behind her. She turned and found Jack looming over her, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He leaned in close, his hot breath tickling her ear as he whispered, "I thought you said you were working?" His voice was low and menacing, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Jane tried to step back, but she was trapped against the counter. She felt a knot forming in her stomach as Jack began to close in on her, his body pressing against hers. As the tension between them reached a breaking point, Jane mustered all her strength and shoved Jack as hard as she could. He stumbled backward, giving her the opportunity to dart around the counter and run for the back room. She slammed the door and fumbled with the lock, hoping it would hold him out long enough for her to escape. But just as she thought she was safe, she heard the door begin to rattle violently from the other side. Her heart pounding in her chest, Jane scrambled to find a weapon of some sort. Her eyes landed on a broken bottle of motor oil on the floor, and she snatched it up, brandishing it like a club. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "I'll do whatever you want. Just leave me alone." But Jack only laughed darkly, and his hand reached out to stroke her cheek again. "Oh, Jane," he whispered, his voice thick with desire. "I've wanted you for so long." As he leaned in closer, Jane felt her resolve beginning to crumble. She took a deep breath, mustered all her courage, and brought the bottle of oil down hard against his arm. With a pained grunt, he stumbled backward, giving her enough time to dart past him and out the back door. She sprinted down the alleyway, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to the limit. When she finally reached the end, she collapsed against the brick wall, gasping for air. Looking over her shoulder, she saw Jack emerging from the store, a look of fury etched across his face. "You're not getting away from me that easily," he growled, starting after her. Desperate, Jane scrambled to her feet and began to run again, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't outrun him forever, but she refused to give up without a fight. As they raced down the alley, she reached into her pocket and found her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "Help!" she screamed into the receiver. "He's after me." Her pursuer was gaining on her quickly now, his breath hot against her neck. "Give it up, Jane," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "It's only a matter of time before you're mine." Jane shuddered at his words, but she refused to let him break her. With one final burst of energy, she darted out onto the main street, weaving in and out of the late-night crowds. She looked over her shoulder just in time to see Jack lose her in the crowd. Panting heavily, she ducked into a nearby bar and collapsed into a booth. The bartender, a kind-looking older man, hurried over to her side. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Jane nodded, trying to catch her breath. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just give me a minute." But as she looked around the bar, she realized that she wasn't fine and she wasn't safe. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jack would find her somehow. She knew she had to keep running, and she couldn't do it alone. With a deep breath, she turned to the bartender and told him everything that had happened. The man listened intently, his expression growing more and more concerned. When she finished, he nodded gravely and said, "I think it's time you called your friend back and had her come pick you up. You shouldn't stay here any longer than you have to." Jane nodded, grateful for his understanding. She pulled out her phone and dialed Lisa's number, her fingers trembling as she waited for her friend to answer. As she waited for Lisa to arrive, Jane couldn't help but wonder how Jack found her in the first place. Was it something she said or did? Or was it just a matter of time before someone like him came along? One thing was certain. She couldn't go back to her old life. Not after this. She'd have to find a way to start over, somewhere far away from here, where no one knew her name or what she looked like. Because as long as she was in this city, she knew that Jack wouldn't ever really let her go.
Story 3. A Twisted Tale of Home Alone.
Tommy was a brave and curious boy who lived in a small town called Pineville. He was just 12 years old and loved exploring. One evening, his parents had to go out of town for an emergency, leaving Tommy alone in their big old house. They trusted him because he was responsible and smart. Tommy's house was very old, with creaky floors and strange noises at night. It stood at the edge of a thick forest, which made it even scarier when the wind howled through the trees. Tommy wasn't afraid, though. He enjoyed the idea of having the house all to himself. After dinner, Tommy decided to watch his favorite TV show. He settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. As he was laughing at a funny scene, the lights flickered. He thought it was just the old wiring and continued watching. But then, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Tommy grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. He checked the circuit breaker in the basement, but everything seemed fine. He figured it must be a power outage affecting the whole neighborhood. As he walked back upstairs, he heard a loud thump coming from the attic. Tommy's heart raced. He tried to calm himself by thinking it was just an old house noise, but curiosity got the better of him. He decided to check the attic. He climbed the creaky stairs, the flashlight beam shaking in his nervous hand. The attic door was old and heavy. Tommy pushed it open slowly, and it creaked loudly. The attic was filled with dusty boxes and old furniture covered in white sheets. As he stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight caught a shadow moving in the corner. Tommy froze. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound brave. There was no answer, just the eerie silence. He took a deep breath and moved the flashlight around. Suddenly, he saw it. A figure standing still in the corner, covered in a dusty old sheet. Tommy's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He approached the figure slowly, his hands shaking. Just as he reached out to touch the sheet, it fell to the ground with a loud thud. There was nothing underneath it. Tommy jumped back, dropping the flashlight, which rolled away, casting wild shadows on the walls. In the dim light, Tommy saw something that made his blood run cold. On the far wall, written in what looked like dark red paint, were the words, "Leave now." Tommy's mind raced. Was it a prank? Did someone break into the house? He needed to call his parents or the police, but his phone was downstairs. He turned to leave the attic when he heard a whisper. "Tommy!" It was soft, barely audible, but it was his name. He spun around, searching for the source. The attic was empty, but he felt a cold breeze pass by him, sending shivers down his spine. Tommy bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind him. He ran downstairs, 2 steps at a time, and grabbed his phone from the living room. He dialed his parents' number with trembling fingers, but there was no signal. He tried the landline, but it was dead too. He was completely cut off. Tommy knew he had to get out of the house. He ran to the front door and yanked it open, but to his horror, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something invisible was holding it shut. Panic set in. He ran to the back door, but it was the same. He was trapped. Suddenly, the house grew colder. Tommy could see his breath in the air. He heard footsteps coming down the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Tommy backed into a corner, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Tommy! The whisper was louder now, and he could feel a presence in the room with him. His eyes darted around, but he saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move. It was tall and thin, and it moved silently toward him. Tommy squeezed his eyes shut, wishing it all to be a bad dream. But when he opened them, the shadow was right in front of him. It reached out with a cold, bony hand and touched his shoulder. Tommy felt a chill spread through his body, freezing him in place. The shadow leaned in close, its face inches from his. In the dim light, he could make out hollow eyes and a wide, menacing grin. It whispered again, "You shouldn't be here." Tommy felt like he couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow seemed to enjoy his terror. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving Tommy gasping for air. The lights flickered back on, and the warmth returned to the room. Tommy didn't waste a second. He ran to the window, desperate to escape. This time, it slid open easily. He climbed out and ran into the yard, not stopping until he reached the neighbor's house. He banged on the door until they answered, breathless and shaking. He told them everything, but when they went back to his house, it was empty. There were no messages on the wall, no signs of a struggle, just an old, quiet house. Tommy's parents returned the next morning, finding him safe but shaken. They never believed his story, thinking it was just a child's overactive imagination. But Tommy knew the truth. The house had a dark secret, and something in the attic didn't want him there. From that day on, Tommy never stayed home alone again. The memory of that night haunted him forever, a twisted tale of a boy who faced the unknown and barely escaped. And every time he passed by the attic door, he felt a cold shiver, remembering the whisper that chilled him to the bone.
Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to listen to similar stories in future.